The 1950s by History.com. America at this moment, said the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1945, stands at the summit of the world. During the 1950s, it was easy to see what Churchill meant. The United States was the world's strongest military power. Its economy was booming, and the fruits of this prosperity, new cars, suburban houses, and other consumer goods, were available to more people than ever before. However, the 1950s was also an era of great conflict. For example, the nascent civil rights movement and the crusade against communism at home and abroad exposed the underlying divisions in American society. The post-war booms. Historians use the word boom to describe a lot of things about the 1950s. The booming economy, the booming suburbs, and most of all, the so-called baby boom. This boom began in 1946, when a record number of babies, 3.4 million, were born in the United States. About 4 million babies were born each year during the 1950s. In all, by the time the boom finally tapered off in 1964, there were almost 77 million baby boomers. After World War II ended, many Americans were eager to have children because they were confident that the future held nothing but peace and prosperity. In many ways, they were right. Between 1945 and 1960, the gross national product more than doubled, growing from 200 billion to more than 500 billion. Much of this increase came from government spending. The construction of interstate highways and schools, the distribution of veterans' benefits, and most of all, the increase in military spending on goods like airplanes and new technologies like computers, all contributed to the decade's economic growth. Rates of unemployment and inflation were low, and wages were high. Middle-class people had more money to spend than ever, and because the variety and availability of consumer goods expanded along with the economy, they also had more things to buy. Moving to the suburbs. The baby boom and the suburban boom went hand in hand. Almost as soon as World War II ended, developers such as William Levitt, whose Levitt towns in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania would become the most famous symbols of suburban life in the 1950s, began to buy land on the outskirts of cities and use mass production techniques to build modest, inexpensive tract houses there. The GI Bill subsidized low-cost mortgages for returning soldiers, which meant that it was often cheaper to buy one of these suburban houses than it was to rent an apartment in the city. The Civil Rights Movement. A growing group of Americans spoke out against inequality and injustice during the 1950s. African Americans had been fighting against racial discrimination for centuries. During the 1950s, however, the struggle against racism and segregation entered the mainstream of American life. For example, in 1954, in the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education case, the Supreme Court declared that separate educational facilities for black children were inherently unequal. This ruling was the first nail in Jim Crow's coffin. Many Southern whites resisted the Brown ruling. They withdrew their children from public schools and enrolled them in all-white segregation academies. And they used violence and intimidation to prevent blacks from asserting their rights. In 1956, more than 100 Southern congressmen even signed a Southern Manifesto declaring that they would do all they could to defend segregation. Despite these efforts, a new movement was born. In December 1955, a Montgomery activist named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give her seat on a city bus to a white person. Her arrest sparked a 13-month boycott of a city's buses by its black citizens, which only ended when the bus companies stopped discriminating against African American passengers. Acts of nonviolent resistance like the boycott helped shape the civil rights movement of the next decade. Society in the 1950s, looking at the past through the lens of society. If one word could describe American society during the Eisenhower era, it would be restless. We tend to imagine the 50s as a tranquil decade, but in fact, Americans spent the years moving and searching. They moved physically from the Northeast to the South and the West. California's population grew by 49% during the 50s. Florida by 79%. They moved from the rural areas to cities and from cities to suburbs. By 1960, a third of the country's population lived in the burbs. Many people were content, but many others felt ill at ease because of the speed at which the world was changing. Searching for new ways of coping, they embraced religion and visited psychiatrists in unprecedented numbers. The automobile revolution. Americans were well on the way to becoming a motorized society before the 1950s, but the Depression and the halt in auto production during World War II slowed the growth of America's car culture. During the 50s, though, the number of cars in the U.S. nearly doubled from 39 million to 74 million. By 1960, 80% of American families had at least one car, and 15% had two or more. By making radical year-to-year design changes, Detroit automakers encouraged consumers to scrap older cars to buy the latest models, even as often as once a year. On average, 4.5 million cars were junked every year during the 1950s. By 1960, Americans owned more cars than all the rest of the world put together. The interstate highway system. Eisenhower was an opponent of extravagant federal spending. Yet, one of his most enduring legacies is the interstate highway system, which his Secretary of Commerce called the greatest public works program in the history of the world. The new freeway system, officially known as the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, had a military as well as civilian purpose. It could be used to rapidly evacuate cities in case of a Soviet missile attack. It was a monumental undertaking to build 41,000 miles of four-lane roads. The nationwide construction project, which involved building more than 16,000 entrance ramps and 55,000 bridges, would not be fully completed until the early 1990s. The roads, whose wide shoulders and easy curves were designed for high-speed driving, would end up costing a grand total of some $129 billion. To satisfy urban interests, sections of highway were constructed into and around cities. The historian Lewis Mumford predicted that Americans would regret all the damage to our cities and our countryside that this ill-conceived and preposterously unbalanced program will have wrought. No one listened. Americans were delighted with the ability to drive from place to place at high speed with no stoplights or intersections to worry about. The impact of the auto. Many Americans wanted to escape the cities and live in surrounding suburbs, and the automobile allowed them to do so. The cities suffered economically and culturally as a result. Highway construction near cities displaced residents and divided neighborhoods, further hastening urban deterioration. On the other hand, new businesses catering to car owners flourished. Drive-in movie theaters boomed. There were 3,000 in operations nationwide by 1956. Motels became common, led by chains like Holiday Inn. Shopping malls, offering new shopping convenience, began to appear everywhere. By the middle of the decade, 1,800 shopping centers had appeared in the United States. Fewer and fewer people went to the inner city to shop, leaving the streets of many cities largely deserted at night. Teenagers take the stage. The term teenager was rarely used before the 1950s. During the Eisenhower years, young people began to see themselves as a distinct group. Their attempts to forge an identity worried adults who couldn't understand the shift. The change was connected to the nation's affluence. Earlier in American history, young people often had to work full-time jobs to help support their family's basic survival. By the 1950s, that was usually no longer the case. Teens instead worked part-time jobs or received allowances from their parents, giving them money to spend on fun non-essentials. In part, the phenomenon was inspired by the returning GIs of the late 1940s, who, after surviving more than 4 years of World War II, had a lot of wild oats to sow. Teens of the following decade imitated the defiant, rebellious, let-loose pattern of this slightly older group. Juvenile delinquency did exist. Fights among gang members, vandalism, car theft, and random violence were reported in the newspapers every day. But youth gangs had been around for generations. So too had urban violence. A rapidly growing population of young people and extensive coverage by the mass media made the problem seem far graver than it was. Young people adopted the fashions of gangs, the slang, the leather jackets, and ducktail hairstyles. Just as many teens in more recent years have adopted the fashions of gangsta culture. But then as now, most of these stylistically rebellious teens did not commit crimes or get in trouble with the police. Instead, they eagerly embraced the mobile culture. They owned cars, cruised the highways, and frequented fast food outlets and drive-in movies. They brought records and adopted rock and roll as the sound of their generation. But the youth movement of the 50s did not overturn society, as some grown-up experts feared it would. Youth rebellion was aimed at parents and the confines of daily life, not at society as a whole. The only youthful rebels of the era, who you might truly call revolutionary, were the African Americans who participated in serious protests against wider injustices in society. Most white teenagers did not concern themselves with social problems, and some educators referred to them as a silent generation. Like many in the 50s, they were restless. But as they grew up, they tended to adopt the norms of the wider society. Almost half the young men of the era were drafted and served dutifully in the United States military.